The babysitter's rules. I didn't believe them until it was too late. I've always loved kids and thought babysitting would be an easy way to earn some extra money while studying for my degree. When Mrs. Thompson called me out of the blue and asked if I could watch her two children, Lily and Max, for a few hours one evening, I didn't hesitate to say yes. She offered an incredible hourly rate and assured me that the kids were well behaved. The job seemed like a dream come true. The evening started off normally enough. I arrived at the Thompsons' home, a large old house on the outskirts of town, and was greeted by Mrs. Thompson, a pleasant woman in her mid-40s. She introduced me to Lily, a sweet 5-year-old with curly blonde hair, and Max, a quiet 7-year-old who seemed a bit shy. After a brief tour of the house, Mrs. Thompson handed me a list of rules and instructions. She looked at me with an intensity that made me uneasy. "These rules are very important, Hannah," she said. "Please follow them exactly," I nodded, taking the list from her. "Of course, Mrs. Thompson." "I will," she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you. We'll be back around midnight." With that, she and Mr. Thompson left, and I was alone with the kids. I glanced at the list of rules, feeling a little silly. How hard could it be to babysit for a few hours? 1. Always keep the doors and windows locked. No problem. It was an old house, and I figured they just wanted to be safe. 2. Do not let the children play outside after dark. Fair enough. It was already evening, and the yard was surrounded by dense woods. 3. Do not answer the phone unless it rings twice in quick succession. A bit odd, but okay. 4. Bedtime is at p.m., no exceptions. That seemed reasonable. 5. If you hear whispering, ignore it. Do not investigate. That one made me pause. What kind of whispering? But I shrugged it off as overprotective parenting. 6. If Lily starts singing, do not interrupt her. Wait until she finishes. Lily was humming to herself as she played with her dolls. It seemed harmless enough. 7. If Max asks you about the shadows, distract him immediately. Creepy, but probably just a way to keep his overactive imagination in check. 8. Under no circumstances should you go into the basement. That was fine with me. I hated basements. I put the list aside and joined the kids in the living room. They were watching a cartoon, and everything seemed perfectly normal. After a while, I made them dinner and helped them get ready for bed. As the clock struck 8, I tucked them in, read them a story, and turned off the lights. "Good night, Hannah," Lily whispered, her voice soft and sweet. "Good night, Lily." "Good night, Max," I replied, closing the door gently behind me. I went back downstairs and settled onto the couch with a book. The house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Around 9 o'clock, the phone rang once, then twice in quick succession. Remembering the rule, I picked it up. "Hello, Hannah? It's Mrs. Thompson. How are things going?" "Everything's fine," I replied, glancing around the room. "The kids are asleep and everything's quiet." "Good," she said, sounding relieved. "Remember to follow the rules and everything will be fine, of course," I said, trying to sound confident. After we hung up, I went back to my book, but my mind kept drifting to the list of rules. What did they mean by whispering? And why couldn't Max talk about shadows? Suddenly, I heard a faint sound coming from upstairs. It was like a soft, rhythmic chanting. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was Lily singing. Remembering the rule, I stayed where I was, listening to her song. It was a haunting melody, and it sent chills down my spine. She sang for what felt like an eternity, before finally falling silent. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. This was ridiculous. It was just a song, but the house felt different now, like the air was thicker, heavier. A few minutes later, I heard another sound, this time from the hallway. It was a soft, whispering noise, just barely audible. I strained to hear what it was saying, but I couldn't make out any words. My first instinct was to get up and check on the kids, but the rule echoed in my mind: if you hear whispering, ignore it. I stayed on the couch, my heart pounding. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It felt like it was coming from right behind me, but I forced myself to stay put. After a few agonizing minutes, it stopped. The house was silent again, but the sense of unease lingered. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming down one step at a time. I turned toward the sound, my breath catching in my throat. Max appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes wide and frightened. "Hannah," he whispered, "the shadows are moving." I remembered the rule and quickly stood up. "Hey, Max, do you want some hot chocolate?" "Let's go to the kitchen." He nodded, his eyes darting around the room as if he was afraid something might jump out at him. I took his hand and led him to the kitchen, trying to keep my voice light and cheerful. "Do you like marshmallows in your hot chocolate?" I asked, hoping to distract him. He nodded again, but his grip on my hand tightened. I made us both a cup of hot chocolate, and we sat at the kitchen table. Max kept glancing over his shoulder, his fear palpable. "Max, what did you see?" I asked gently, trying to keep my own fear at bay. "The shadows," he whispered. "They're watching us." A shiver ran down my spine. "It's okay, Max. You're safe here." He shook his head. "They're everywhere. They want to take us." I didn't know what to say. I tried to reassure him, but his fear was contagious. I decided it was best to put him back to bed and hoped he would fall asleep quickly. As we walked back up the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I tucked Max back into bed and stayed with him until his eyes finally closed. As I turned to leave the room, I caught a glimpse of movement in the hallway. My heart leaped into my throat, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. Back in the living room, I paced nervously, my mind racing. This job was turning out to be far more than I had bargained for. The rules, the whispering, the shadows, it all felt like something out of a nightmare. At around 11:30, the phone rang again, twice in quick succession. I answered it with a trembling hand. "Hannah, it's Mrs. Thompson. Is everything okay?" "I am not sure," I admitted. "Max was talking about shadows, and there's been strange noises. Just follow the rules, Hannah," she said firmly. "We'll be home soon." She hung up before I could say anything else. I set the phone down, my hands shaking. What was going on in this house? A sudden noise from the basement made me jump. It was a soft, rhythmic thumping, like someone knocking on a door. The rule about the basement flashed through my mind. Under no circumstances should you go into the basement. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard anything, but the sound was persistent. I took a deep breath, trying to muster my courage. Maybe it was just a loose pipe or an old furnace acting up. As I stood there, debating what to do, the knocking grew louder, more insistent. Against my better judgment, I found myself moving toward the basement door. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. Just as I was about to turn it, a voice behind me made me freeze. "Hannah, don't." I spun around to see Max standing at the top of the stairs, his eyes wide with fear. "Go back to bed, Max," I said, my voice shaking. "Please, don't open the door," he whispered. "They'll get out." My heart pounded in my chest. Who will get out? "The shadows," he said, his voice barely audible. "They're trapped down there. If you open the door, they'll come for us." The fear in his voice convinced me to step back. I guided Max back to his room and tucked him in once more, promising him that I wouldn't open the basement door. Back in the living room, I sat on the couch, my mind racing. The knocking continued, but I forced myself to ignore it. Whatever was down there, I didn't want to find out. Finally, just before midnight, the front door opened, and Mrs. Thompson walked in, followed by her husband. Relief washed over me at the sight of them. "How was everything?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room. "It was eventful," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded, as if she expected that answer. "Thank you, Hannah. You did well." I gathered my things and headed for the door, eager to leave the house and its unsettling secrets behind. As I stepped outside, Mrs. Thompson's voice stopped me. "One last thing, Hannah." I turned to look at her. "Yes, never speak of what happened here tonight." "For your own sake." I nodded, too shaken to argue, and left the house. The drive home was a blur. My mind was filled with thoughts of shadows, whispers, and the rules I had barely understood. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. The darkness in my room seemed thicker, more oppressive. I kept the lights on, unable to sleep, haunted by the events of the evening. The next morning, I woke up with deep, dark circles under my eyes, despite barely sleeping. As I dragged myself to the bathroom, I noticed something odd in the mirror. There were faint, shadowy figures flickering behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a remnant of the night's terror. Over the following days, the occurrences escalated. I would see fleeting shadows out of the corner of my eye, hear whispering voices when I was alone, and feel a chilling presence in my room at night. My grades started to slip, and I found it hard to concentrate on anything. Friends noticed the change in me, commenting on how tired and distracted I seemed. One night, as I was studying for an important exam, the power went out. I sat in the dark, trying to steady my breathing, when I heard the familiar whispering. It was louder now, almost as if it was inside my head. I clutched my ears and squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't stop. Suddenly, a cold hand grabbed my ankle, pulling me off my chair. I screamed and kicked, but there was nothing to fight against. The whispers turned into menacing growls, and the shadowy figures closed in around me. Just as quickly as it started, the power came back on, and the shadows vanished. But the fear remained, a constant reminder that I was never truly alone. I knew then that the shadows had followed me home, and they were here to stay. No matter where I went, I could feel their presence lurking in the corners, watching and waiting. The babysitting job that seemed like a dream had turned into a never-ending nightmare. Desperate for a solution, I contacted Mrs. Thompson, hoping she could help me banish the shadows. She listened to my plight with a knowing expression, and then reluctantly gave me a small, worn book titled Warnings Against the Dark. She explained that it contained rituals and protections that might help me rid myself of the shadows. I spent the next few nights carefully following the instructions in the book. I lit candles, burned herbs, and recited incantations. Each night, the presence of the shadows seemed to weaken. On the third night, after completing the final ritual, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief as the shadows dissipated, leaving my room feeling lighter and more peaceful. Although the immediate threat was gone, the experience had left a permanent mark on me. I no longer took safety for granted and always followed the rules Mrs. Thompson had given me, even in my own home. I never took another babysitting job, and the memory of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder of the things that lurk in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The true horror had just begun, and it was far from over. But at least, for now, I had found a way to keep the darkness at bay. Story 2. My Tinder date made me take a shower in front of her. There was no bio on Ruth's profile, only pictures, and within a handful of messages, she'd asked me over to her place. Straight out of the gate that was 2 red flags, but she swore she wasn't a catfish, so I suggested we grab a cheeky pint first. That way, if a hairy biker dude turned up and made kissy faces at me, I could make a speedy getaway through the fire exit. Ruth looked like a Greek goddess in her thigh-high skirt and trench coat. She had these stunning onyx eyes and almost seemed to glow in the dinky little pub. Every time she tossed her hair, the other drinkers stole glances in the back bar mirror. She looked different from the photos, sure, but still leagues above me. I went for a hug, which she redirected into a firm handshake. Ruth wore thick winter gloves even though the fireplace in the corner was roaring. As I caught a trace of her scent, fresh and lovely, a sensible voice at the back of my mind screamed, "What's the catch?" Surely any second now she'd trick me into emptying my bank account. Crap, maybe she'd already swiped my credit card. I patted my pockets. Wallet, phone, Pokémon keychain. Nope. All there. Already, the marshal waving the 3rd red flag was a speck in the rearview mirror. The bartender took our orders. I asked for a pint of Guinness, whereas Ruth stuck with tap water. Then we eased into a conversation about our lives. When I started telling her about life in the IT game, she yawned sarcastically. Chuckling, I said, "Well, what do you do then?" "I'm between jobs." "Between what and what?" "Between surgeon and anything that doesn't involve bodily fluids." "Huh. I thought they might have warned you about those in medical school." "I didn't always have a problem with them." "There was a traumatizing experience." She shuddered as if reliving a painful memory. "Anyway, let's talk about your sex life." Caught off guard, I spat a mouthful of Guinness all over the counter. An agitated Ruth grabbed a wet wipe from her pocket, cleared the mess, and then readjusted the placemats and ashtray so everything aligned perfectly. The ginger bartender side-eyed her, but said nothing. The beautiful brunette told me she had a bunch of kinks, and I'd be lying if I told you my heart didn't flutter a little. She asked whether I was ready for another drink. I was, although I took small, steady sips, because I never could handle my alcohol. Any more than 4 pints usually resulted in me clinging onto the toilet bowl like a life raft. Finally, I just came out with what was nagging at me. "Ruth, don't take this the wrong way, but are you real? Like, what's the catch here? Am I gonna wake up tomorrow missing a kidney?" That made her chuckle. "I'll be honest. There is a catch. I'll tell you if you promise not to make fun of me." I crossed my heart. She leaned close, pushed her pouty lips right up against my ear, and said, "I'm a clean freak. Like a major clean freak. If you come back to my place tonight, I need you to wash yourself the second we get there." As her gloved finger ran along my shirt collar, she fought the urge to retch. "Those clothes will need cleaned too. I've got a fresh pair you can borrow. And you must brush your teeth. Also, have you got an ear wax remover with you? If not, you can borrow one from my emergency kit." I asked whether she was serious. "Deadly. I absolutely cannot stand filth. I need you. Spotless. Sound good?" A winning lottery ticket had blown into my hand. I finished my pint in one long gulp, wiped away my foam mustache, and said, "Sounds great," in the front seat of her Volvo. Ruth handed me a breath mint. Probably because a trace of my aunt's famous cottage pie lingered on my breath. She drove west out of town, toward an ultra-modern house standing against the forest. The straight angles of the white building looked odd juxtaposed against the pine trees, and there was an angular barrier around back keeping the vermin at bay. The sterile stench of disinfectant stung my nostrils the second we stepped through the front door. Everything was meticulously organized, all straight lines and spotless, like something from an IKEA catalog. You could have performed open-heart surgery in any room. There wasn't a single piece of furniture not covered in plastic, and two stuffed kittens batting invisible string stood guard in the downstairs landing. "Aren't they cute?" Ruth asked when she noticed me staring. It's like she occupied an alternative, shrink-wrapped universe. She made me kick off my shoes, then I followed her to the end of the hall. Standing in the middle of the bathroom, she watched as I stripped off. Her neutral expression stung. She grabbed my clothes into a ziplocked bag which she held away from herself like radioactive waste, and then she provided clear instructions about which soap and shampoo I needed to use. I bit down on the temptation to tell her I'd been washing myself for years. The sarcasm is probably what kept me single for so long, and stepped into the shower. Ruth left a white linen shirt and a pair of jeans folded neatly over the towel rack. The earwax remover on the edge of the sink operated like something out of Star Trek. I figured out the settings eventually, though. In the lounge, she handed me a shot of something fruity and sour. We clinked glasses and drank. The liquid burned on the way down. I went to sit on the sofa, but the plastic made it slicker than a water slide. I fell to the ground, and before I could pick myself up, my head got heavy and the air became stale. What happened next is a blur. 1 minute, the ground was shifting beneath my feet. Next, I'm flat on my back. My legs were stuck. Alcohol was sloshing around the pit of my stomach, and breathing was borderline impossible. I made myself look down, a surprisingly difficult process. Past the end of the bed, Ruth rose into view, a mean-spirited grin on her face. She was encasing my legs with shrink wrap like an Egyptian mummy, gradually working her way north. I opened my mouth. No words came out. "Shh, this won't take long," she said. She swung her leg over my midsection, straddling me. Then she leaned forward and pushed her lips against my ear. "Don't worry, I'm going to take care of you. You look so handsome, all lovely and spotless. I'm just making sure you stay that way. Forever." Her tongue probed the inside of my ear, and then she went to fetch medical equipment from the corner of the room. My brain couldn't piece the mess together, but I knew I needed to get out of there. Fast. I tried flexing my leg muscles, but lacked the strength. Ruth's arms clamped tight around my ankles. "Stop. You're messing everything up," with all the energy I could summon. I thrashed from side to side until I fell off the bed. The wooden floor hit worse than concrete. I opened my mouth to groan, but instead a great flood of vomit shot out as if launched by a supercharged sprinkler. Chunks of cottage pie flew in every direction. A fountain of half-digested beef mince, onions, carrots, and garlic. Ruth rushed over to restrain me, but I rolled away, and as I did, her shoes skidded through the rancid contents of my stomach, and she fell. The germaphobe popped right back up. She looked at her palms, then the wet patches all down her back, and then her throat made this strangled sound like a cat hacking up a furball. She grabbed a set of wet wipes and started scrubbing herself clean furiously. Sensing an opportunity to escape, I crawled away like a worm, leaving behind a snail trail of barf. "Get back here," Ruth screamed. She physically couldn't stop scrubbing her hands long enough to come after me. I crawled down the hall, around a bend. At one point, I needed to use the crown of my head to force a door open. The entire time I was coughing and trying to keep that morning's breakfast from creeping up in my throat. Soon I was conscious enough to realize my left arm was free, whereas the right was pinned against my torso. To my left was the kitchen. Maybe there was a sharp object there I could cut the shrink wrap with. I fumbled towards a central island, crawled up the side, and pulled on a drawer. Cutlery fell all around me with a series of metal clangs, followed by the drawer. My free hand dug through the pile for a knife, finding only spoons. Finally, I grabbed a fork and stabbed at the wrap until my other arm came free. I was like a butterfly emerging from its cocoon. Footsteps came shuffling toward the kitchen. Freeing my legs would take way too long. They still only had a few inches of wiggle room. I would be at Ruth's mercy. Just then, something rancid slid up my throat, so I opened my mouth and spat a fat, sticky oyster of what had once been scrambled eggs and bacon, but now looked like an alien life form into my palm. The beautiful psycho burst through the door. In her hand was a syringe. She launched herself on top of me. My left hand caught her forearm at the last possible second, while the right smeared my biological weapon across her face. As the vomit omelet dripped from her cheek in fat glops, she released the needle and went into furious convulsions. Quickly I rolled on top of her, grabbed the fallen drawer, and bashed her across the side of the skull. I did this until her eyes rolled back. Then I crawled away on my elbows. In the hall, there was a phone on top of a side table. I punched in 999. The operator couldn't understand me, but sent a squad car anyway. I remember telling myself to stay awake in case my kidnapper recovered, but here, my memory jump gets to a circle of emergency responders staring down at me. The officers had a hard time believing my story. A concussed Ruth said I went crazy and attacked her. On the way to the station, they took us to the hospital to patch up our cuts and bruises. Everybody seemed to believe I was the aggressor until the police searched the area surrounding the house. In the forest, they spotted a pack of rats scurrying around some bushes, and beneath it, there was a body, partially buried, badly decomposed, and wrapped in plastic. A post-mortem confirmed it was the corpse of a local man who disappeared 6 months earlier. I'd seen his mother crying on TV. There were holes in the crotch and left arm of his shrink-wrap prison, where they believed a catheter and 4 drip had been inserted so Ruth could keep the poor guy alive, but in a state which prevented him from contaminating her perfect house. Ruth is denying any wrongdoing. Hopefully, the prosecutors get their act together soon, although I'm told it could take a year before sentencing. Wheels of justice and all that. I'm still on the road to recovery, mentally speaking, but I'm ready to start looking for love again. Except this time, I'll be careful not to ignore any red flags. Story 3. I found the old blog of a childhood friend who went missing in 2009. Jim was an aspiring writer. He often told me that every great storyteller opens with a setup and closes with a punchline. Well, I'm not a writer, so don't expect big things from me. I'm going to tell this tale as simply as possible. I read Jim's blog, and it frightened me. 3 posts from a best friend who went missing 15 years ago. I found them yesterday. It was the anniversary of his disappearance, which seemed like the perfect day on which to nostalgically peruse our old conversations. He used to send me flurries of memes and hyperlinks. I didn't always read every message. And somehow, I managed to overlook something essential from 2009. A link lost within Jim's final manic influx of messages. His private blog. Entry 1 July 6, 2009. I just saw my next-door neighbor kill his wife. That shouldn't excite me, should it? But it does, and I'll tell you why. Miss Benson frequently says that I'm a talented writer. But what use is a bright spark never seen? I need to make a mark on this fast-moving, forgetful world. And writers are remembered for stories, not words. Now I'm only 17 years old. I haven't lived, so I haven't had stories to tell. But I've written prolifically, written until my eyes and hands have hurt. I know how to write. I just haven't known what to write. Until today. This blog may well be my magnum opus, my finest piece of literature. Don't care for my pretension. I don't care for your dismissal. You'll soon see what I see. This tale is a masterpiece, not for its prose, but its story. I finally have a story. I would like to preface the tale by clarifying that I wasn't snooping. I happened upon this bold scene. That's all. I'm not interested in the slightest about the lives of Mr. and Mrs. Ackhurst. Well, I wasn't interested. That changed 4 hours ago. Isn't it strange that the slightest happening can fundamentally alter the trajectory of human history? If Gareth weren't so bad at GTA, maybe I wouldn't have rage quit. Maybe I wouldn't have left my room to prepare a pre-midnight feast in the kitchen. And maybe I wouldn't have looked out of the window. I wouldn't have seen Mr. Ackhurst standing in the upstairs bathroom, smiling as he feverishly fed the shower head into his wife's throat. With a spare hand, he spun the tap, increasing the water flow, rapidly pumping his wife full of liquid like a flesh balloon. I am ashamed to confess that I didn't save the woman. I could have done so at any moment, but I didn't. Fear may have driven me into cowardice, perhaps, may have frozen me. By the time I woke from that terrible trance, it was all over. Mr. Ackhurst sighed, unburdening himself of the tense knot in his stomach before basking in his awful triumph. The imposing man reeled in the shower hose, removing the blood-stained shower head from his wife's throat. He cradled her body, eyeing her discolored skin and swollen, lifeless eyes. Then the spent man dragged her rag doll form out of the room. It would have been responsible to immediately call the police. I wasn't frozen after all. I could have moved. I could have picked up my phone and dialed 999. But if I'd done that, my story would have ended there. Mr. Ackhurst's story would have ended there. And I never would have become a writer. Not in the truest sense of the word. Not in any way that would cement my legacy, which is the only thing that matters at the end of the day. I did not alert the authorities, and I won't until I visited the house. I felt a little sick after reading that initial post. I thought back to 2009, remembering the unfortunate passing of Mrs. Ackhurst, remembering the ambulance that arrived in the night, stirring everybody in the neighborhood. But I wasn't aware of Jim's involvement in the night's horrible events, and I've barely begun to tell you about all of the awfulness that happened. The first unsettling thing worth mentioning is that the ambulance arrived on July 8th, but Jim's initial post was on July 6th. I'm reading the old conversation with my friend as I speak. July 8th. That was when we messaged each other about the ruckus on our street. Mrs. Ackhurst was definitely found on that date, which means Jim knew of her murder 2 days before anyone else. And there was more horror to come. Horror that he never thought to tell me in person. He never even asked whether I read the private blog. After reading the other posts, I'm glad he didn't. Entry to July 7th, 2009. It is 3 in the morning. 4 hours after I first locked eyes with the maniacal man in the window across the road. It feels as if it has been an age since I uploaded the last post. I keep thinking about Gareth. Are you reading this, friend? How long has passed? You're sleeping soundly in your bed right now, no doubt. Possibly ignoring my messages as usual. You're only a 5-minute walk away from this nightmare. 5 minutes. Sneaking out of the house without detection was no impressive feat. Not really. I didn't even bother to cover my tracks. Mum and Dad are absent even when they're home. I know my friends pity me, pity my loveless makers. But I wouldn't have it any other way. I would have never forgiven those monsters if they'd stopped me from crossing the road, entering the Ackhurst house, allowing my greatest story to unfold. As I approached the Ackhurst residence, I noticed that there were no lights in the property. My heart raced a little as I considered the possibility that Mr. Ackhurst had spotted me peeping, but I stilled myself. I knew that Mr. Ackhurst hadn't looked over at the property, hadn't seen me watching from the kitchen. I decided that he must have turned off the lights to clean up without detection. He possibly realized that he'd been foolish for not drawing the curtains, not turning off the lights in the first place. Perhaps he'd struck his wife in a fit of passion, hadn't taken the time to properly plan his kill. Alternatively, I considered that he may have been sleeping soundly. He may have felt absolutely nothing about what he's done, may have been sleeping like a baby. I sailed around the edge of the property, moving on nimble feet with a gleeful grin on my face. Gleefully anticipating my moment of heroism, I should clarify. There was nothing about the night's events to be celebrated. I was simply dreaming sweet dreams of capturing Mr. Ackhurst, becoming known as the courageous young man who'd brought a killer to justice. A vigilante with not only a story to tell, but the capacity to tell it well. I was relieved to find that the side door already had a shattered window. There was no need to find a stealthy route of entry. No need to worry about being detected. I slid the door open, towed a heavy rock off the mat, and entered the lightless home. Fear gripped me as I heard panicked movement upstairs, creaking floorboards and a muffled voice. The patter of frantic footsteps traveled along the upstairs corridor, and then came the descending thuds of stairs groaning under the weight of the homeowner. "Mr. Ackhurst," I called. "It's over." The monster and I met in the dark entryway of his home. He eyed me fearfully, wondering why he'd been disturbed, wondering why the intruder was a 17-year-old boy, no doubt. Youth was the greatest mask I had. We're verging on adulthood, Gareth. People will stop giving us leeway, sooner or later. "Jim," the man cried, "what are you doing in my house?" I did not falter for a moment. Couldn't afford to falter when faced with a man taller and stronger than me. I had to focus on the plan, had to beat him with the strength of my mind, not my body. I would walk out of that cursed graveyard with his decapitated head in my hands if necessary. The upstairs tap was running. I remember that. It was the only sound in the lightless house. I'd caught the man off guard, and that was the only advantage I had. With every passing second, that advantage was slipping away. The sound of running water drowned the crime. A terrible truth with such awful weight that I prayed it would sink far from view. Though I could not resist, Gareth, could not resist telling you. Such a legacy doesn't deserve to be buried. The man barreled forwards, and I held firm, rigidly sticking to the plan. Whatever my fate, I was determined to be remembered. I am no moron, of course. I did not enter the pitiful man's hovel without a weapon to wield. I pulled the stainless steel from my pocket as Mr. Ackhurst charged towards me, watery eyes emblazoned with something. A feeling I did not, or perhaps could not place, for his mind was a mystery to me. The emotion may have been fury, perhaps. A fearful fury. Those tears multiplied and cascaded when my blade punctured his abdomen. I barely even moved the blade. Mr. Ackhurst did a fine job of moving into it, and the lobby was so dark that the man had clearly not detected any glint of a steel edge. No foreboding sign of his impending doom. As his mouth opened, I twisted the knife, gutting him in a rushed attempt to prevent any retaliation. Repeated thrusts and turns of my blade quickly quelled any ideas he may have had. The man fought meekly, placing one hand on my neck in a meager attempt to muster a loose grip as the life quickly fleeted his body. And then the house was silent. I could have been more meticulous, could have chosen a better instrument, a better way to attack, but I survived. It was over. The story was strange, and not in a way that intrigued me. That was my first thought. I was terrified for a reason that seemed just out of grasp. But after an hour or so of repeatedly reading the second entry, I finally came to a conclusion. Jim, at the very least, wasn't telling the whole truth. And even after what I read in the final post, the whole truth is something I'm still trying to ascertain. I have more haunting questions than answers. Entry 3, July 8, 2009. Hello, Gareth. You should know by now that I made this blog for you. Only you. I hope that, upon finishing my disturbing tale, you put it in the hands of those who might know what to do with it. Some day. I really do pray you read it. I'm sure you will. Today, I finally alerted the authorities. A moment that should have been exhilarating, ruined by a terrifying development. It's currently 1 in the morning, and I'm packing my bags. I must leave. It isn't safe for me here. You see, I failed. I didn't cover my tracks. I didn't eliminate the threat. I was a little off at school yesterday. You noticed that. You may be awful at responding to messages, but you're a good friend, Gareth. A very good friend. I've always known that, and it's why I'll never forget you. I do wish I could stay. Wish I could explain everything. But he's here. That's my fault. I was incredibly sloppy, and my heroic antics may have all been for naught. The man's brother visited. I came home from school, preparing to finally alert the police and tell them my brave story. But then I saw it. The car on the driveway. A blue Porsche that I didn't recognize. I immediately panicked, of course, because I hadn't finished the cleanup, and the scene in the house didn't exactly paint me in a favorable light. I rushed across the road. Had to be quick. Had to tidy up my mess before Mom and Dad came home. I beelined towards the side door, which was still a broken mess, swinging in the breeze. And there was a wailing voice emanating from the main hallway. I know. Why did I leave the body there in the early hours of yesterday morning? Well, I was interrupted. Don't think less of me for my stupidity, Gareth. Please. I was meticulous in every other regard. The Ackhursts didn't have friends or visitors. I thought it'd be safe to leave them there until the following evening. It was a foolish decision, but that doesn't make me a foolish man. I realized, upon entering the home, that I had very few options. Few reasonable options, I mean. What could I have done? Killed Mr. Ackhurst's brother, too. He was an innocent man. That wouldn't have painted me in a heroic light. And I accepted that as his eyes met mine. That was when I realized I had to run. I'm on the road as I type, Gareth, jotting down my final thoughts. The conclusion to my frustratingly brief tale. I had hoped for a satisfying conclusion, but life sought to rewrite my story. How rude of it. The authorities have been notified, but I won't be there to tell the tale in person. Still, a hero does not act for glory. A hero is altruistic. That is how legacies are formed, right? And my legacy, whatever it may be, shall be eternal. You may think very little of those 3 posts. Without any context, I suppose the only horror to be gleaned from Jim's writings would be the deaths of Mr. and Mrs. Ackhurst. But I think, even without context, that you likely feel what I feel. Something doesn't add up. You'd be right. Terror worked its way into my gut as I processed everything I'd read, comparing it with the events that I remembered from my childhood. The bodies of Jeffrey Ackhurst and Patricia Ackhurst were found in their home on July 8, 2009. Town gossip, thanks to a few blabbermouth police officers, brought the finer details to light. Jeffrey's corpse was found in the entryway as Jim had claimed. Patricia's corpse was found in the bathroom, also as he claimed. However, there is another piece of information worth noting. I thought it better for you to read Jim's 3 posts first. The police have always suspected Jeffrey's brother, Rudy Ackhurst, to be the killer of the couple. And what led them to this working explanation? Jeffrey's time of death was estimated to be an hour before Patricia's time of death. I kept thinking about that as I read Jim's disjointed account of events. Thought about how it didn't make sense that my friend would have been able to describe how Jeffrey felt whilst killing his wife. Thought, more importantly, about how it didn't make sense that Jim would have been able to see Mr. Ackhurst kill Mrs. Ackhurst. Jim was telling the truth in his second entry. He did kill Mr. Ackhurst. I have no doubt about that. But my friend couldn't have seen Patricia die in the upstairs bathroom because her husband was already dead. And if Jim weren't avenging the woman, why on earth did he savagely slaughter Jeffrey Ackhurst? I think I know. We all know, don't we? But I don't want to accept it. Just as I don't want to accept who really killed Patricia Ackhurst. For years, it was believed that Rudy Ackhurst had killed his brother and sister-in-law before kidnapping or murdering Jim Harlow, for whatever reason. But it's clear that we've been believing a lie. I thought about the closing sentence in entry 3. The punchline, as my friend would call it. And my legacy, whatever it may be, shall be eternal. Jim was right. Given what he's done, he will be remembered. I gave this evidence to the police, and they've reopened the case. The town is alive with talk of the Ackhursts once more. I thought that telling the authorities would have put an end to this nightmare, other than the thoughts which plague my mind, but I saw something this morning. A figure watching me from a local bus stop. One who looked, to my eyes, like an older version of Jim Harlow. That could have been paranoia, but something terrifying confirmed it this evening. Something that prompted me to make this post. A handwritten note through my letterbox. It isn't kind to fib, Gareth. Shall I write your story, dear friend? Pen your closing chapter in a way that nobody will doubt? The more I think about my old childhood friend, the more I remember the oddities I overlooked for years, amplifying the quakes in my chest. I keep imagining awful scenarios. Jim slinking into my home, returning to silence me. And given the man's creativity, I am haunted by the prospect of him fabricating a wonderful tale about my untimely end. One that would serve his legacy. Story 4. Since 1998, the people of my Alaskan hometown have been frozen in time. I shouldn't have returned. When the edged wind came to our village, it seemed like a typical Alaskan gust, one fitting for late December. Then, as the tall tide of frost lashed against the shore of our home, the sagging branches of the yellow cedar trees stopped bouncing, and I abandoned the idea of the breeze being a breeze at all. Once others understood that, the time for running had passed. The unholy wind reached the village's main road, causing 2 moving cars to sharply and statically stop. The vehicles were frozen in place, much like the people within those metal graves. Onlookers enjoying a brisk afternoon in the park began to scream as loved ones succumbed to that supernatural end. Imprisoned in a capsuled moment of time. Those first few victims were the lucky ones. They'd been oblivious to the fate which awaited them. True terror was endured by those who beheld the raw power of the wind. Those unfortunate enough to see the incoming. Regardless, the remaining townsfolk, burdened with the awareness of impending doom, futilely attempted to escape the approaching breeze. Those fleeing residents, far slower than the unnatural frost, were halted in haunting poses as the wind bit into them. Limbs were suspended in mid-air positions. Eyes were left wide and unblinking. Mouths were cursed to forever gape in horror. "Run!" Dad screamed, sprinting towards us from a nearby park bench. My brother, my childhood friend, and I were sitting in a sandbox. Already engrossed in a fantasy world, I wondered whether my imagination had conjured the wind. I thought my mind had transcended to a higher plane. It was my way of processing the trauma. However, I accepted the reality of the situation when my father shoehorned the three of us into his Volkswagen Golf. The icy jaws of the wind were nearly nipping at the rear of the vehicle as Dad twisted the key in the ignition, but the beat-up car rapidly lurched forwards. My father wrenched us away from the frost, seconds before it consumed us. "Daddy, where are we going?" I tearfully asked. "I don't know, Jillian," he weakly moaned, maneuvering around fleeing cars and pedestrians. "Are we picking up Mummy?" Alan asked. Dad ignored my brother's question. I was only 8 years old at the time, but I knew that my mother wasn't coming. I understood the significance of the tears in my father's eyes. For 26 years, I successfully managed to suppress that memory. Did such a good job, in fact, that I almost believed it had all been a dream. I started to believe that we had simply moved away from our hometown, and Mum had simply chosen to stay. Dad never convinced me otherwise. He never talked about what happened. Neither did my brother. As for Leon, he moved to an orphanage in Anchorage. We wrote to each other for a couple of years, but his replies became less and less frequent. Eventually, he stopped responding entirely. I used to wonder why my father didn't adopt my childhood friend, but I suppose that would have forced him to accept what happened. And like me, he had no intention of doing that. I thought we would run back to England, having failed to achieve the American dream. But Dad kept us in Alaska. I assumed that he'd been driven by stubbornness. Or guilt, perhaps. We'd already fled our home. Perhaps fleeing across the pond would have been a step too far. Perhaps it would have felt like truly abandoning our mother. Whatever his reason for staying, Dad didn't tell anyone the truth. He never went to the police. He never returned to look for Mum. "Don't look back, kids," I remember him whispering as we fled the frost. I followed that advice for the next couple of decades, only recalling the event for the briefest moments from time to time. When Dad bought the first computer for our family in 2000, I Googled the name of our old town. I typed the word before realizing I was even doing so. I was still young, of course, but I knew that nothing about our speedy departure had been normal. I wanted answers. I'd expected to discover that my village had become a ghost town. That would have made sense. Alaska's unforgiving climate breeds desolate places, born to be abandoned. However, the search results revealed nothing, so I told myself I'd imagined the village. I told myself we'd always lived in Anchorage. As the years passed, I became comfortable with the notion that none of it had ever been real. Not even my mother. And that was why I did not expect to see a certain person again. "Happy birthday, Jill." My jaw dropped when Leon Taylor appeared on my doorstep. It might seem strange that I would recognize a man who was a child when I last saw him, but Leon always had distinctive features. I immediately identified the mole on his neck, just below his facial scruff, and those sorrowful eyes, shadowed by his unmistakable overgrown brows. "Leon," I gasped, "what are you doing here?" The man smiled weakly. "Sorry, Jill. I should have done this the millennial way. No. Reconnected through Facebook. No, I just never thought I'd see you again. Do you want to come inside?" I asked, motioning at the hallway. Leon nodded, so I made a couple of coffees whilst my old friend seated himself in the living room. A boy who I'd almost forgotten, almost entirely erased from existence, just like our old town. But I'd always known, just beneath the surface of my shallow memories, that it had all been real. The truth of my childhood was always within reach. As I brought the drinks into the lounge, hands trembling, I tried to dispel the thoughts flooding my mind. Thoughts of that awful day. How's your dad? How's Alan? Leon asked, taking the cup of coffee. I sighed. Dad's been unwell for a few years. He hasn't been taking care of himself, and he's getting old. As for Alan, well, Alan's the way he's always been. Uptight and distant. But when was the last time you spoke to him? Leon sharply interjected. The question caught me off guard. Huh, your brother. When was the last time you spoke to him? Leon asked. My face drained. He knows, I thought. How on earth does he know? 3 years ago, I answered. My old friend nodded. Did you fall out? I scoffed. That's an understatement. You remember what he was like when we were kids, don't you? Leon shrugged. He was 2 years older than us. We must have infuriated him, I nodded. Sure. But I grew up, and he never did. We had a big argument, and we haven't spoken since. Interesting, he responded. I raised an eyebrow. You're a man of few words these days. Leon, the man cleared his throat. Your brother messaged me a week ago, my other eyebrow raised. What? It was a very strange message. Did you reply? I asked. I thought you would have preferred to ignore it. He lowered his head in shame. I'm sorry, Jillian. I replied to some of your letters. Then you forgot about me, I said. It's embarrassing that I didn't get the hint. It wasn't embarrassing, Leon sheepishly muttered. I read all of them. Every last letter. Oh, well, that's great. I laughed. Nice to know that you cared. Jillian, Leon paused, lifting his head. I was scared. Scared of what? I asked. Remembering that day, he replied. It's why I told your dad I didn't want to come and live with you. It's... What? I asked. Leon tilted his head. You didn't know? Did you really think he'd just dump me in that place? He might have changed, but your dad was never cold. Still, I refused. Living with you would have reminded me of what happened to my family. I didn't reply, so my old friend prodded the beast. Aren't we going to talk about why did my brother message you? I interrupted, avoiding the topic. Leon twitched his lips uncertainly, as if unwilling to part them. He told me that I had to see you. Leon trailed off. Right, I said. Why? Your brother said something insane, Jillian, he said. He claimed that Arnold Walker visited him in Fairbanks. My jaw fell. I beg your pardon. Arnold Walker, my brother's school friend? Leon nodded. He escaped? I didn't know others got out. I whispered. My old friend's face was growing paler. No, Your brother said something that seemed impossible. He said that Arnold did not arrive on his doorstep as a 36-year-old man, but a 10-year-old child. My stomach dropped. The natural response would have been to discredit such an outlandish story, refuting it with a rational explanation. But Leon's revelation served to do only one thing. It confirmed what I'd always known. A 10-year-old boy made it all the way from our hometown to Fairbanks. I asked meekly. Leon frowned. That's it. You're not going to question it? I did. I messaged Alan repeatedly, but he never replied. Not a nice feeling, is it? I asked, sighing. How did you want me to react, Leon? You were itching to talk about that day. Well, I'm not skirting around the subject now. Let's talk about it. Okay? I know all of that horror really happened. I just never wanted anyone to confirm it. Me neither, Leon said. I was trying to avoid your family for the rest of my life. Your brother ruined that, yeah. He tends to ruin things, I replied. So, that's it. Ellen wanted you to tell me about Arnold Walker? Leon shivered. There's more, but... Look, I know I should have messaged you about all of this first, but I thought about the way Alan avoided my questions. I didn't want you to do the same. I assumed if I were to show up in person, then I wouldn't be able to run away. I finished. I understand, Leon. I just hate that my brother is still too childish to talk to me. Funny. He called you childish, too. Listening to you two bicker is nostalgic. Leon smiled, before quickly adopting a solemn expression. I'm trying to change the subject, but I need to rip off the Band-Aid. Alan said that Arnold took him to a car on the front lawn. There was a man in the driver's seat, barely clinging to life, with a face mangled beyond recognition. Your brother said the man's skin had been peeled from his face, and he was still somehow alive. I shuddered, vomit climbing my throat. Arnold told your brother that the man was Mr. Johnson, Leon whispered. The farmer? The one who ran the local grocery store? I asked, shivering. My friend nodded. Yeah. Alan said he'd aged a little. Well, his hair was grayer than he remembered. The pair must have been on the road for hours, and your brother didn't know how they knew where to find him. He had so many questions for them, but Mr. Johnson died before the ambulance arrived. And whilst Alan talked to the paramedics, Arnold ran away. He's missing. Shit, I whispered. I'll call my brother. You might struggle, Leon said. Alan ended the message by saying that he was going back. Home? I gulped. No, he wouldn't be that stupid. Maybe not. You should try to contact him, Leon said. He hasn't replied to my dozens of messages, but he might reply to you. Not sure he even has a signal out there in the boonies, but you're right. You should try. I spent an hour trying to contact my brother in various ways, but he did not respond. Alan had vanished. And I knew, like it or not, that I had to return to our village too. I should have told Dad. Would have told him, had he not been one bad day away from a heart attack. In spite of the man he'd become, I loved him. I didn't want to remind him of the place we'd fled. One person should be spared the horror of remembering, I thought. Leon and I, two strangers who'd spent formative years together, piled into my Kia, and we drove from Anchorage to a place that I'd long hoped had never really existed. I was going to be horribly disappointed. On a nondescript road that burrowed into the Alaskan wilderness, my throat started to twist and constrict. The outer edge of my vision shrank, and my head pulsated with a slowing rhythm as the world slipped away from me. I struggled to breathe as I came to terms with an awful fact. I recognized that endless road. Jillian, Leon whispered. Don't, I begged. I didn't want to hear it. I wasn't ready. I'd known all along, of course, that our village existed, even when extensive research had revealed nothing about the town. When I thought of the way the breeze consumed the town, erasing its residents, it made sense that it would erase the very place itself. After all, even I'd started to doubt its existence, and I'd lived there. Accepting the unearthly nature of the event wasn't as tough as you might imagine. If anything, I had fought hard to deny it. I wanted to ignore the existence of a paranormal force, though I had witnessed it with my own eyes. Even if there were some Alaskan breeze powerful enough to instantaneously freeze an entire town, we hadn't witnessed that. We'd seen something else. We'd seen that glacial wind freeze the town. Not its people, but its tether to time. After an hour of following the frosted landscape, we saw something familiar on the horizon. Leon's face mirrored mine as our damned village appeared. a bulge of ruin and decay, growing as we neared it. And when we crossed the threshold into the desolate town, the reality of our quest finally dawned on me. "Where is everybody?" Leon asked. It might seem a moronic question to an outsider. Our old village was clearly an abandoned place. No rational person would expect anybody else to be there. Of course, I understood Leon. He had asked the same terrifying question that was circling the drain of my mind, refusing to flush away. I thought back to that terrible day on which hundreds of people froze in time. Then I thought of Arnold Walker and Mr. Johnson, the two residents who'd supposedly shown up at my brother's door. One of them had looked no older than he'd been in 1998. Time resumed, I finally mumbled. "Yes, but where did everybody go?" my childhood friend asked. I didn't have an answer. Neither did my brother, and that was why he'd come here. That's not the real reason, I thought. He was hoping to find her. I rolled onto my old street, noting that the trees swayed in the wind and birds flew overhead. Signs that time was flowing. I wondered whether others had fled in the same fashion as Arnold and Mr. Johnson. I even allowed my heart to soar a little as I considered that my mother might have freed herself, might have found Dad in Anchorage, might be wondering where Alan and I had gone. However, I knew that not to be the case. Mom had not arrived at my door, and there had been no national news coverage about people emerging from a town that didn't exist. There had only been an old, half-butchered man and a quiet boy. Both were gone, and I had questions about the nature of their escape from our hometown, given my brother's ominous message to Leon. Something was still dreadfully wrong with our village. 26 years had not changed that. The people of the village had not disappeared into the sunset. Whatever had happened to them, I knew it wasn't good. Possibly worse than what happened to Arnold Walker and Mr. Johnson. I pulled onto the driveway of my childhood home, gently trundling over cracked asphalt. Weeds squirmed through the wounds of the suburb, as nature sought to erase my childhood from existence. There was no need for that, of course. The wind of 1998, and whatever secrets it held, had already done a fine job of wiping my hometown from reality. "Do you think he's come here?" Leon asked as I turned off the engine. "Yes. We both know who he wanted to find," I said. My childhood friend nodded, and we both somberly climbed out of the vehicle. The village was colder than I remembered. For a mid-afternoon day in late May, it was unseasonably chilly. Alaska, for the most part, is not the Arctic hellscape that many people imagine. Not in all parts of the state, anyhow, and certainly not in late spring. The air also felt stale. It carried the stench of evil, and it seemed to be tinged with frost, as if that demonic breeze were still lingering in the air, nearly 3 decades later. I knocked on the rotten front door, surprised that it did not break with a slight rap of my hand. "Ellen," I yelled. "It's Jillian." My brother did not respond, but I wasn't concerned. If he had been there, and Mum hadn't, then he wouldn't have wanted to stay. I wanted to use that as an excuse to turn around and leave. I already assumed that my mother wouldn't be there, but another part of me knew that my assumption was more of a wish. In a similar way, I had been secretly glad to find nobody in the town. There was only one person I hoped to find in my old village, and that was Alan. I was terrified by the prospect of finding anything else. "Jill," Leon started softly. "Come on. We have to do it, do we?" I asked. This was a mistake. We should turn around. I agree," Leon sharply interjected. "But we have to find your brother. And when we do, we'll convince him to come back with us. We'll convince him to leave this place behind too." "Why did you come to see me, Leon?" I asked. "You could have ignored my brother's message. You could have pretended none of this had ever happened. That's what you did when you started ignoring my letters, isn't it? I deeply regretted that for years, Jill, he said softly. You were my best friend. You were. More than that. We were just kids, but I loved you. I've not made another connection like ours. Not even in my adult life. I know, I replied. I loved you too, Leon. That's why it hurt when you let our bond peter out. If you'd cut me off from the start, I would have understood. But it just felt like you'd stopped caring. Never. I just lost the strength to bear that trauma, he explained. Every letter was a reminder, and That's why I came to your door. That's why I didn't ignore what your brother said. I didn't want something to happen to him. You lost your mother. I didn't want you to lose him too. We all lost things, I sniffled. You lost. More than me. I just don't understand why you'd come back. Why my brother would come back. I don't even understand why I've come back. We never really left this place, did we? Leon asked. Not in our minds. Even though it doesn't exist in the eyes of the outside world, it never left us. Never let go. Arnold Walker and Mr. Johnson lured Alan back. And he lured us back. That's an unsettling way of looking at it, I timidly replied. It's the only way I've been able to look at it, he said. Whatever claimed this place, it remembered us, and it made sure we remembered it. Not that it would be easy to forget. For years, I thought I'd lost my mind, but after talking to you and Alan, I'm not so sure. I find it hard to believe that we'd have experienced a shared delusion. No, it all really happened. And the memory replays in my mind every day. I'll never get rid of it. Dad seemed to do a good job of erasing this place from his mind, I said. I knew that wasn't true, of course. He had never forgotten. That was made apparent by his deterioration. Alan and I had a close relationship with our father before we left that village. Afterwards, he changed. We all changed. Losing Mum had fractured the family, but there was more to it than that. I started to consider that Leon might be right. Perhaps the frost hadn't ensnared the two of us, but it had certainly bitten us. Do you want me to do it? Leon eventually asked. I wanted to be courageous enough to open the door, but I wasn't. I nodded meekly and stepped aside, allowing my childhood friend the nightmarish task of facing whatever lay within my old home. He pushed the door handle down, expecting the house to be unlocked, but it wouldn't budge. Shall we try the back? I asked. Leon backed up. I quickly realized what he was planning to do, and I opened my mouth to utter a protest. My hulking friend had charged before I spoke a single word, however, and he hurled his body into the door. It quivered in its frame, but did not give. Leon, I cried. What are you doing? Well, I don't suppose you have the key? He panted, massaging his shoulder. I held up my hands. Look, let's just. My friend rushed forwards again, and the result was the same. This time, however, Leon released a groan of pain, clutching his arm a little more tightly. You're going to hurt yourself, I said. Let's take it in turns to kick the door. That'll work better, and it won't cripple either of us. Leon nodded, and the two of us firmly booted the door near the handle. The wood quaked, and it only took a few attacks for the door to splinter around the lock. The frame splayed inwards, and the metal mechanism fell loose. Whoops. That worked a little too well, Leon laughed. He led the way into my childhood home, which looked, unlike the street outside, the same as I remembered. The same as it had looked on the day I'd left. There were no shoes left by the door. No muddy prints on the carpet. No indication whatsoever that my brother had visited our old home, which I'd gathered when the front door had been locked. But this was not a relief. I knew, in my gut, that Alan would have gone there first. He never made it home. Leon shivered. This place feels cold. Frozen, I corrected. Frozen in time. Is it safe for us to be here? He asked. What if we end up like the others? It's a bit late to ask that now, I replied. The breeze passed long ago. This just seems to be the horror it left behind. Leon accepted my suggestion. Then he wandered over to the staircase. My friend took one step before halting in place. For a haunting moment, I believed that he had been frozen in time too. I believed that I'd been wrong, and the frost had come for us. But I quickly realized that my friend was still moving, still twitching. He was frozen by fear, not a supernatural gale. There's someone in the bathroom. Leon wheezed. With physical dread in every inch of my body, I joined my friend and looked up. Artificial light spilled beneath the bathroom door onto the dark landing. There might not be anyone in there, I shakily said. Jillian, this is an abandoned town. There is no electricity. Your house is still frozen in time, and it froze with the bathroom light left on. Somebody must have been. Don't say it, I pleaded, upper lip trembling. Do you want me to lead the way? He asked. I didn't. I wanted to run, but I knew I would never forgive myself for doing so. Leon was right, of course. I hadn't allowed him to finish his sentence, but it was clear that he was going to mention somebody in particular. Somebody whose face flooded my mind as we ascended the staircase, one tentative step at a time. Somebody whose name started to tickle my lips as Leon grasped the handle to the door. It wasn't locked. Mom, I moaned as Leon inched it open. My ageless mother was inside. I'm sure I would have screamed at whatever we found, but I was not prepared for the state of the statue before me. Mum was standing at the sink, hands cupped below a stream of tap water, suspended in time. As I had always feared, the frost caught her. It was horrifying enough to be frozen in time for 26 years, whilst the rest of the world continued, but that wasn't why I screamed. I'd braced myself for that possibility. I'd spent my entire adult life coming to terms with it. I screamed because I wasn't prepared to see her face. Mum was smiling. Not a wholesome smile. It was a taut grin that etched an unnerving crescent shape across her cheeks. There was nothing unnatural about the grin, but it looked painful, and it appeared as if cataracts had taken the entirety of her pupils. Mum, I asked weakly, do you hear me? There was no reply. I peered around the side of her face, and I immediately regretted it. Though she was frozen in time, she did not look unaware. I felt her sightless eyes boring into my face, and I quickly jumped backwards. Let's go and find your brother, Leon fearfully said. As I nodded, backing towards the doorway, I locked my gaze onto my mother's profile. My heart pounded as I started to close the bathroom door. I was trying to ignore the idea that had wormed into my mind. The possibility that, behind the glassy cataract, a pupil might still exist, lying dormant, watching me from a face that no longer seemed to belong to my mother. After I shut the door, Leon and I took a few moments to control our breathing. With a slight tremble, my friend finally walked over to the light switch and raised a hand, but I caught his wrist. What are you doing? He frowned. Leave the light on, I whispered. I don't like the idea of leaving her in the dark. My friend's expression softened, and he nodded, seeming to understand my explanation, seeming to empathize. But I was lying. I wasn't worried about leaving my mother in the dark. I was worried about the thing behind that smiling face. Alan didn't come here, I said. Did he really come back? You read the message, Jillian, Leon replied. I know, but I sighed. I know he might not have come to the house, my friend suggested. This is the first place he would have visited, I said. If Mum weren't here, he wouldn't have returned. Well, let's look around, Leon urged. You never know. We might find something else. Something to help your mother, perhaps. You saw her face, I whispered. She looked far past help. Don't say that, Jillian, Leon shouted, eyes watering. You idiot, I thought. I was so self-centered, so focused on finding my brother and my mother. I hadn't thought about Leon's parents. His brother, Carl. People we'd left behind when my father saved us. I remembered Leon sobbing as he begged my father to turn around. I'm sorry, I said. We need to find your family too. Leon viciously shook his head. Only if we find an answer, Jill. Only if we find a way to save them. My friend entered my childhood bedroom, and I followed him. I imagine that visiting one's childhood home is a strange experience for anyone, but strangeness morphs into horror when that home is trapped in a moment of time. I felt physically unwell when I saw the glass of water on the bedside table, fresh as it had been on the day that my dad took us to the park. Life had continued for me, but the town was still trapped in that dreadful, inexplicable day. Jillian, Leon said calmly. There are people outside. He was standing in front of my bedroom window, and when I joined him, eyeing the road below, I saw them. A man and a woman who seemed to be in their mid-40s. The man wore ill-fitting clothes, a checkered shirt 2 sizes too small, and a pair of torn jeans. The woman, on the other hand, wore a pristine, shapely dress with a floral pattern. She looked oddly familiar, though her eyes were jittery and unfocused. It was the man who'd locked his eyes onto our house. I vaguely recognize her, Leon said. I nodded. Yeah. I don't know her name, but I remember her. She looks a tad older, perhaps. I don't know the man, though. You stay here, Leon said, reaching inside his coat. Don't come out. What are you holding? I frowned, noting his shiftiness. Just. Leon concealed his hand within the thick, wintry coat. Are you going to stay in here? My eyes grew as I spotted a glint of metal. You don't? No, Leon? Please. Don't tell me you have what I think you have. We had no idea what we were going to find here, the man protested. I scoffed. Leon Taylor? Carrying a gun? The boy who berated me for killing me a spider. Before he replied, there came the sound of the front door swinging open. And when we spun our heads back to the bedroom window, we saw that the man and woman were no longer on the street. I realized they were inside. Hello, called a man from downstairs. We mean you no harm. I have a weapon, Leon yelled, slipping the pistol out of a hidden holster. Don't shoot. It's Bernie Bradley. The man shouted weakly. My mouth gapped. Bernie Bradley was in my brother's school year. I remembered him. And as I recalled the face of the man I'd seen on the street, I didn't find it hard to believe it had been the face of that same boy, 26 years into the future. What do you want? I yelled. To help you, he replied. Before they come. Who? Leon asked. I'll tell you if you put that weapon away, Bernie said. I don't trust you enough for that, my friend growled. Are you Leon Taylor? The man asked. Why? Leon responded. Sydney Manley pushed you off the swing set, and you called her a fat cow, Bernie said. She ran home in tears. It wasn't enough. In a place like that, which defied all laws of rationality, it wasn't enough for Bernie Bradley to know that. But Leon and I needed it to be enough because we were hopelessly alone, hopelessly afraid, and hopelessly desperate. My friend Ray holstered his weapon, and we walked onto the landing. Bernie and the woman were midway up the stairs. The man's hands were raised, but the woman barely seemed aware of where they were. Barely seemed aware of herself. Leon Taylor and Jillian Maynard. Is that right? Bernie asked. How did you recognize us? I asked. You were the only ones who escaped, he replied. The Maynards and Leon Taylor the only ones? Leon asked incredulously. Bernie nodded. Others tried, but the frost got them. So why aren't you? I started, unable to finish. Mind if we sit down before I answer that? He asked. I looked at Leon, and my friend begrudgingly nodded. We all headed to the living room and sat down. Once we did, Bernie Bradley told us an incredible story, and the woman beside him simply rocked on the sofa, face painted with a disturbing smile. Bernie had been a 10-year-old boy, sitting at his bedroom desk when the chill swept through his room. He told us that he remembered nothing but a black void. He might have been there for an eternity, or it might have been less than a moment. When he woke from that dark slumber, still a 10-year-old boy sitting in the desk chair, Bernie looked out of the bedroom window. He was overcome by the horrible feeling that time had been lost, but he didn't know how much. And when he saw residents frozen in the street, he realized that something awful had happened. Bernie found his own paused parents in the kitchen, and they were completely unresponsive to his pleas. The lonely, frightened boy ran through the town, calling for help. Nobody answered. After a long day of searching, he returned to his house in tears. For a week, Bernie lived on cans of food from the cupboards. And then he heard shouting from the street. Hello, is anybody there? A man called. Bernie ran outside to find Mr. Johnson. The farmer had just woken from a darkness to find the town full of statues. Bernie told Mr. Johnson that he'd been alone for a week, but he had no idea how long he'd been frozen before that. The boy wanted to leave, but the farmer said they had to save as many people as possible. They had a duty to do so. After all, neither the farmer nor the boy knew what might happen to them if they were to run. The frost might return. Anyway, Mr. Johnson took Bernie under his wing. The crops in his field, thankfully, had unfrozen, as had his entire farmhouse. Mr. Johnson fed Bernie, and the two of them survived. A week later, they found Elizabeth Coulter, the local head teacher, wandering through the town. Over the course of the following year, a dozen more unfrozen souls were saved and brought back to Mr. Johnson's farm. But things changed as time passed. The newer thawed souls were unhinged. The longer a person had been trapped in that black stasis, the less human they became. They were still intelligible, but they spoke only of the voice in the void. A voice that they missed in the land of the living. They were irritable, but Mr. Johnson cared for them, all the same. Eventually, they fled. This only worsened as the years went by. After a decade, Bernie's mother and father unfroze. However, his dad ran, and his mom only remained because she was lost and confused. She would rant and rave about the speaker, the one that would make everything better, the one that would make them all eternal. It was during the year of 2018 that things crossed a terrifying line. Mr. Johnson had decided that newcomers were not welcome. It was a decision of necessity, not cruelty. The recently unfrozen folk had become more than unintelligible. They had become dangerous. Hark! The speaker calls. Walter Frankton screamed. The middle-aged man who had once been a police officer was standing outside Mr. Johnson's farmhouse. When the community of sane people emerged, they screeched at the sight of Walter holding a charred body above his head. Nobody identified the burnt corpse, but Mr. Johnson wasted no time in drawing his rifle and giving Mr. Frankton 10 seconds to flee. Bernie explained that Walter laughed demonically before disappearing into the night. Over the coming years, bodies were found in the street. Followers of the speaker would relentlessly pursue Mr. Johnson's community, so the sane folk kept distant from the people of the speaker. Few of Mr. Johnson's followers understood why they stayed, yet nobody felt able to leave. Something was keeping them there. A couple of weeks before Leon and I arrived, however, Bernie said that Mr. Johnson finally announced his plan to leave. There were murmurs of uncertainty. Everybody wanted to escape, of course, but fear had always stopped them. Still, they trusted Mr. Johnson. If anybody had the power to safely lead them away from the place controlling their minds, it had to be the brave farmer. Packing and preparations began. However, some days later, Bernie Bradley happened to look out of an upstairs window and notice Mr. Johnson. The old man was wandering aimlessly onto the driveway, stumbling like a drunken man towards his vehicle. Bernie said there was a small child standing beside the car. The young boy led Mr. Johnson to the driver's door with a smile, and the two of them fled. Things disintegrated after that. When a Molotov cocktail found its way through a window, the community dispersed. The sane folk fled in different directions, and Bernie was left alone with his mother. "We've been running for days," Bernie explained. "I keep finding the bodies of people from my community. Charred corpses in the street. I tried to leave this town, but it wouldn't let me. The farther I drove, the sharper the pang in my heart. I knew I'd die if I were to keep going. How did you find us?" Leon asked. "I heard you," Bernie replied. "Hard to miss the sound of an engine in a dead place like this. I had a hunch that it might be you. You must have heard my brother then?" I asked hopefully. Bernie frowned. "Alan's here. That might explain the raucous a few days ago. I don't know what I heard. Noise. Lots of it. You won't find him, Jill. You have to run whilst it still lets you. The frost might be gone, but something lingers, the speaker." Leon asked. Bernie nodded. I was fortunate enough to never hear it, or never remember hearing it. I don't know what it said to them. My mother won't tell me. Bernie looked at the woman next to him, the one who appeared to be the same age as him, though I realized he was still a decade younger. The horror of our town had aged him beyond his years. "It will be so glorious." Bernie's mother giggled, eyes bearing faint pupils behind mild cataracts. "You're lucky that they didn't see you arrive," Bernie said. "Otherwise, you'd be dead already. But they'll come, sooner or later. And you need to listen to me if you want a safe way out of here. Okay? We need to distract them. Keep them off your backs." I shook my head. "I need to find my brother. I know he came to this town. I thought I'd find him in our home, but Walter wanted him," Bernie's mother hissed. The woman stopped rocking, stopped smiling, and her head snapped to face me with such eerie speed that I thought it might entirely disconnect from her neck. Bernie quivered, seemingly just as horrified by his mother's words as the rest of us. "Mother," he asked. "Walter wanted him. Walter wanted him. Walter wanted him." The woman laughed, taunting me. "What does she mean?" I sobbed. "Does Walter Frankton have my brother?" Bernie's face whitened. "If he does, your brother's either been flayed or charred." "Christ, Bernie," Leon replied. I sniffled. "I won't leave until I know he's already dead," Bernie bluntly said. "We don't know that." I cried. I thought the others were sitting in stunned silence because I'd spoken so assertively. However, as I calmed my breathing and the throbbing sensation in my ears quieted, I heard it too, the sound of laughing voices. Bernie's mother strained to smile broadly. She looked as pained as my mother, but grateful for the privilege of the discomfort. "You don't want to see this. We'll head through the back." "Do not look at the street," Bernie hoarsely pleaded as I rose. But I was already running to the door. I flung it open and started to run down the path, with Leon and Bernie in tow. Then My eyes met the mob spilling beyond the end of the street. The crowd easily numbered 100 people, and each face wore a terrible smile. Eyes glassy, yet all-seeing. There was a man shuffling from the crowd towards me, like a terrified toddler taking its first steps. I tried to blot his face from my mind. I didn't want to see it, though it was too late for that. I'd seen everything the moment I faced the crowd. Eventually, I fell to my knees and howled as I embraced the truth. The shuffling man who had been flayed alive was my brother. Alan reached towards me with an outstretched hand, weakly shouting something, before toppling forwards. He was reduced to a motionless heap on the road. "Jill," Leon cried again, rushing to me. "We have to go." I continued to wail as the gleeful crowd surged forwards. I resisted Leon, but he easily hauled my limp body to the car and bundled me into the back. "He needs help," I blubbered. "He's gone, Jill," Leon whispered. "What about your family?" I asked. "They're all gone," he sniffled, stepping on the accelerator. Staring through the rear view window, I watched the crowd approach my old home. Bernie stood on the front porch, and his mother had her hands on his shoulders. The man did not run. As we pulled off the driveway, it almost seemed as if he, too, finally had a smile on his face. The mob swarmed Bernie, and I heard a brief cry of agony. It may have been ecstatic or fearful. It may have been both. After we crossed the border, no chill pierced us. We were free to leave. But I know Leon and I belong to that town. I have always suspected that the wind grazed its teeth against my skin when I was a child. It grazed all of us. For even now, I still feel that link. That urge to return to the salivating mob with a smile on my face. When I returned home to find that my father was missing, I knew he felt it too.